Welcome to Novelist Spotlight, the podcast where published fiction writers are interviewed to gather their insights and writing lessons so we can use them to make ourselves better and more effective writers. There are just 3 things I ask of you, if appropriate to you and your experience. Please subscribe, please click on the like button, and please share this program link with any family members, friends, or colleagues who might be interested or benefit from the content. Now, on with our program.
Hi, I'm Erika T. Wurth, author of White Horse, which is my Big 5 debut. It's Indigenous literary horror, and it's about Carrie, who despises the mother she thinks abandoned her when she was 2 days old until her super well-intentioned cousin finds her mother's bracelet. And when the main character, Carrie, touches it, her mother starts to haunt her, and she decides she has to find out what happened to her mother after all.
And as always, this is Mike Consul, your host. And we welcome Erika T. Wurth to the program. And Erika, I want to just start right off by saying that your novel, White Horse, your Big 5 novel, as you put it, with a major publishing house, it's written in first person. Talk a little bit about the decision to write in first person. Is that your modus operandi, or did you just feel like the story would best be told first person in this case?
You know, I was a super geeky kid, and I read a ton of science fiction and fantasy when I was growing up. And oftentimes it was told in third person omniscient with that sort of God narrator. And so I would try to write in that when I was younger. And I realized that I'd grown up with such vivacious personalities that it was actually more like I really had a talent, if you will, for writing in first person, because I could really capture those personalities. And so I think Carrie is one of those personalities. She's just a kind of a tough, really smart, well-read, extremely pragmatic person with a very distinct personality. And I think the first person did serve her well. Now, in the main character is Carrie, Kari, spelled the Norwegian way, and written in first person. I suppose some people feel like first person is more intimate, that there's a greater connection. Do you feel that way as well? Yeah, I think it's interesting because I've noticed that in some ways it'll cause people to connect with the character, but also since human beings are often, liars, occasionally it'll cause someone to be like, I'm irritated by this character. I think it's because, human beings just sort of can't help but do this, right? So we would naturally distrust one another. But for Carrie, it also too, I do think it's not to say it's easy. It's actually hard to capture a really distinct voice, but handling third person limited and really doing it right, so it's not dry or omniscient, which you're going from one POV to another. They're challenging in different ways, and so to me, I think, like I said, this seemed to capture what I was doing in the novel the best and capture her personality the best.
So the title White Horse has a meaning to it. It is set in Denver. In fact, I think you say it's old Denver. And the White Horse was an actual establishment. Is it still around? Why don't you go ahead and tell our readers about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not, I guess it's old Denver in the sense that it's set in 2016. So it's really funny. Someone was interviewing me and they're like, from long ago, as if I meant 1920s, or the 1800s. And I was like, it's really not that long ago. But it's old Denver in the sense of, if Denver, it's kind of like what happened to Seattle or Portland 10, 20 years ago. Has been happening to Denver in the last 10-ish years, where, everything is becoming extremely expensive. All of the old institutions that if you grew up in the area, which I did, I grew up right outside of Denver, that are either, disassembling or falling apart. And so I wanted to kind of give honor to that Denver that I grew up near and around and in. And so the White Horse is a very old bar. It's been around in Denver since the 1930s, and then it became a very Indian bar in the 1960s. And it was an Indian bar where you go after the powwow, where you go, if you wanted to snag or what have you, you'd go to the White Horse. And then unfortunately, it just sort of, I think as Denver became more expensive and there were shinier places to go, it just died. And that's where Carrie's right in the middle of, right? In 2016, it was still open, but it was dying. And you'd go and it was mainly empty. And now, unfortunately, the owner was getting up there, and he closed it. And I think he would love to see someone take it up as it stands, but he also knows the property is tremendously valuable, and I think he's asking $3 million for it. So, yeah.
Well, you said an Indian bar, and you kind of gave it away when you said powwow, but I just want to emphasize that we're talking about a Native American Indian bar. You yourself are of Native American descent, correct? And if so, what tribes?
I primarily identify as an urban Indian. My family has been urban for generations. I'm Cherokee, Apache, and Chickasaw descent. Some of my family, the Chiricahua Apache, they were originally in both the Americas and what is now Mexico. And then my family was in Mexico at one point and then came up into Texas. And that's how they met up with my Cherokee and Chickasaw family, who had migrated into eastern Texas instead of Oklahoma. And then at one point, actually, my Cherokee family did move back up to Oklahoma and then into parts into Indiana and parts back into Texas. So yeah, I'm very urban.
What does it mean to you to be Native American? A lot of people take pride in their ethnicity. You're a non-immigrant, the only non-immigrant. I mean, only Native Americans are non-immigrants, and that's such a big issue these days. It must kind of put a smile on your face at times, or a frown. Does it mean anything special or particular to you to be a Native American?
Well, I mean, my father was very white. He was Irish, English, German, and Dutch, I believe, and Scottish. And so I grew up, with a very complex sense of self. I think most natives would answer that really differently. Pride is kind of a funny issue. I think it's more about this is part of who I am, and no one can take that away from me. And I grew up around powwow. I grew up with other natives. I grew up listening to Dana Spector. I grew up listening to Anishinaabe. I grew up listening to Lakota being spoken. And, I think there are 1,000 billion natives who are far more traditional than I am, some of who live in Guatemala, some of who live in Denver, some of whom are from reservations. And so I think the thing to bear in mind is that inside our communities and outside of our communities, there are people trying to crush that sense of diversity within our communities. And that's the opposite of what I've been trying to do for 20 years. For 20 years, I have tried to, write articles, prop other Native writers up, make sure that Black natives, Latinx natives, natives from reservations, natives who are very urban, different tribes, different perspectives, enrolled, state, all of us have a voice. And I think that is fundamental to our spiritual and artistic health.
What is your spirituality? Are you, is it Native American? Is it the Great White Spirit? Is it Lakota? Is it Apache? Do you, and maybe you don't have any spiritual beliefs, but to tell us about whether you have actually adopted the longstanding spiritual tradition of Native peoples.
Spiritual, that's a fairly private question, so I'm just going to keep it brief. I think, and it always kind of is would anyone ask anyone else of any other ethnicity these kinds of
I would.
Things?
I'm that way.
But yeah. So my family was Native American church. It's sort of a combination of Mexican, Indian, Lakota, and Navajo or Dene traditions. And it's different everywhere. In Oklahoma, it's different. In other places, it's different. I think there are natives who identify as, atheists, and that's fine. That doesn't make them less Native. And I haven't adopted anything. My family's been Native American church off and on, and sometimes extremely evangelical Christian for generations. Some were Catholic traditional, some were one of the Christians, so it's, yeah.
Years ago, I introduced Terry Gross of Fresh Air at an event, and I remember her saying while she was up there that anytime she interviews anybody, she always says, you can refuse to answer anything you want, which gives me the freedom to ask anything I want. So, and I often forget to tell our guests that I like that deal. I think Terry Gross is very smart for saying it that way. I picked it up from her, and obviously, if any question I ask, Erika, you just that you feel is out of bounds or too personal, you just say so. But thank you for answering that one.
Yeah.
You did get a doctorate in creative writing and literature. What was your undergrad degree in, though?
English. I've been a nerd since birth.
Well, so you knew what you wanted to do. How old were you when you decided, I want to write, I want to learn the language, and I want to express myself through the written word? How long ago was that?
It was really more or less the first thing I wanted to be, and I don't know why, because I didn't. My parents had been very working class, but they had fought their way into the middle. But that said, I didn't know any writers. I had no idea what that meant. I just knew that I liked Stephen King, and I knew that I liked books with dragons in it. And for some reason, I just decided one day that I would do that too. And I had no idea what that meant. I was really, really young. And then when I did go to PhD school, they sort of ironed out, what they called genre. They were like, that is an inferior kind of writing, and you want to write what they called literary and what I would call drama or realism. And over time, I did write a number of, I have a collection of short stories, a couple of collections of poetry, a couple of novels with smaller presses, whom, of course, I respect tremendously. But they were realism. And in the end, I just sort of missed the dragons. And I realized also that literary is not a genre. It's a series of conventions that can be applied to anything, right? It's complex characterization, attention to form and language, and depth of theme. And you can do that with, dragons or the subject of a dying marriage or a spaceship. Right.
I mean, Anne Rice did it with vampires.
Totally, I loved her. Yes.
Yeah. She, sensual, beautiful writing about a subject that later became a genre and was not written nearly with the adeptness of Anne Rice. Let me ask you about why you write. What does writing do for you psychically or emotionally? What is the payoff?
Being trolled on the internet. It's kind of funny because when I've worked for 20 years to not speak for anybody else, but just make space for people like me, right? But there's just no way around it. When that happens, and when you're actually finally successful, and you're on Good Morning America or whatever, people, there's just that come down, and people will be awful. But a lot more people, the thing to remember is more people will be wonderful. And so many people, I'm very strongly connected to the urban Indian community in Denver, very strongly connected to a number of people from the tribes that I descend from, who are citizens. And I'm very strongly connected to the Native American writing world and the writing world in general. And that's because I'm known as the person that you come to if you need help. Not because I'm mercenary, not because I want anything back, but because I was raised to share knowledge and share space. And so that's just been something that's really valuable for me. I don't know why. I've asked myself a lot about why people become artists. I suspect it has to do with tension, because, I think the heart of any great work, regardless of genre or, content, is there's tension somehow, really well executed, complicated tension. And I think that I come from a background where that was so in a number of ways. And so I suspect that's what it is. I know that I feel guilty if I don't write. I don't feel like myself if I don't write. So I think, I suppose that's the payoff,
So you're not fully realized as a person unless you're writing. That's how you feel. So talk about your household growing up, because tension is something that is so important to writing, as you know, as you alluded to right there. As an example, I grew up in an Italian household. There was a lot of high volume conversation and argument and lots of conflict, lots of tension, and we all loved one another, but that's just part of who we were culturally. Was your household one in which tension was ever present and you're comfortable with it and you know how to use it and express it and even deliver it with a great deal of nuance?
I think in some ways, talking about, for example, my spirituality, it's only because the only time I'm like, is only because I feel that sometimes there's this measurement stick about who's a real Indian or not. And I think that there are people very few people, but people in our community that will, pull that stick from the way that it's been created in the, non-native world, and they'll try to beat other Indians with it, and it's icky. But contradictorily, I will say, I don't mind talking about my background in general. And yes, my dad was an aerospace engineer. He come from a very working class white background from Staten Island. And he was an alcoholic, and he was violent at times, but he was smart, and he read to me as a kid. He read the Martian Chronicles. He read Louis L'Amour, and that really formed, I think, who I am. And then my mom was this woman of mixed Native descent from Texas. And she, her dad, I think, was maybe of some Black and Indian descent, but primarily he was white. And my mom grew up as the darkest skinned one in the family. And she wanted to be an artist too. She wanted to be a dancer. And her mom had a 5th grade education. Her dad had an 11th grade education, but her mom supported her on that. Her mom was just a really, really interesting woman. Her first marriage was when she was 14. Her second marriage was when she was 17. And then she had 4 kids, I think, total. And so, she really wanted my mom to be educated. And my mom was, and she, at first it was in education, but then she went back to her first love, which was teaching dance. And so her father had won some property in Texas, gambling. And he built her a little dance studio, and she went back to that, and she married my dad, who's an aerospace engineer. Eventually I was born in California. They ended up in Denver, where I was raised, right outside of it in the mountains. And she, she owned a dance studio. And so I think, in some ways, growing up, right outside of Denver, going to school, high school and junior high in Idaho Springs, I was raised in this very class and, race diverse area. Like, it was primarily working class whites where I went to high school, but there was a large amount of Latinx and North American Indians and of different kinds. I mean, there's just a large chunk. And so I grew up with that. And, class-wise, my parents, they were middle class, but they had just come out of poverty. And then I did this big leap by going into my PhD, which initially my parents were like, "Ooh, boy, are not so sure about." So, and I just was a big geek. I just wanted to read all the time. I had terrible grades in high school because I read under the desk. And then I got to college, and I started to get really good grades. And my parents, I think, thought I'd bribed somebody.
Yeah, what a difference it makes when you're studying something you're really interested in. All of a sudden, the grades are good instead of stuff that you don't really care so much about or maybe aren't as good at.
Exactly.
I've done a little trolling of you on YouTube, and I do believe there's a story behind the idea for writing White Horse that maybe even is harrowing. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, in some ways it was just going back to my nerd roots. I really missed horror and science fiction and fantasy. And I think what I like about horror is it kind of allows people to address some of the darker themes, but there's a bit of a dark portal-esque magic to it. But the other part of it has to do with my grandmother. And the absolute facts are that my grandmother, she died when I was 6, and my mother was very, very, very close to her. And what we had been told, however my trolls may want to twist this, what we had been told was that she had committed suicide. And then years later, my mother told me that, look, I went back to my hometown. Someone, I forgot exactly the circumstances, but they found the death certificate, and they said, this looks doctored. I hate to tell you, but it kind of looks like your dad, because he was well known in the area, might have murdered her. So my mom went through a long period of not forgiving her. And what's odd is my aunt decided to become super born again evangelical, and she decided to super identify with her father, who, like I said, was I guess mainly white, whatever that could mean. And so they just ended up with extremely divergent lives. My mom's a dancer. I would call her agnostic. My auntie, after being powwow, Native American church, all that, went to identify with her father, not her mother. So I guess she believes her mom committed suicide. I really don't know. I can't speak for her. and, was a big evangelical Christian. And so, that kind of tension in my family over what really happened, and the sort of sadness, because I remember my grandfather. I barely remember my poor grandmother. But my grandfather was like this kind of tough, but quirky, funny guy. And it is really tough imagining that, gosh, maybe he did kill her. Maybe they argued, or maybe they wrestled for the gun. Maybe she did suicide. It's so hard. No one knows. And I feel like, statistically speaking, whether you are enrolled or not, urban Indian and or reservation women have a very high percentage of, violence towards women. Murder, disappearance, suicide, all these are issues. There are loads of wonderful things about being Indian too. But statistically speaking, someone isn't going to get murdered because they are enrolled or not enrolled. And my grandmother, like I said, we don't know. And it was sad because she'd had really beautiful parts of her life, but she'd also had a very tough life.
So your mom taught dance, you said. What kind of dance does she teach?
She loved jazz, and so that was her specialty, and she'd done dinner theater when she was young in Houston. And she grew up in Houston, right in the area in one of the suburbs. Her dad was a park ranger. And she then owned a dance studio, like I said, and did it for years. And she taught jazz. And then as she got older, she migrated to teaching really young kids. And so I'd come in and they'd be marching around with Looney sticks. And they were just too adorable and, crying. And then, all the things that kids do. So, yeah, that's the last probably 10, 20 years of her dancing career was that.
So did she teach you to dance? Are you a dancer?
She tried really hard, and it was so bad, and I'm so uncoordinated. And I often refer to myself as like the Native American Kramer. So she'd be like, how about you go in the back? How about you? That's not my daughter. Which I have her exact face and voice. So yeah, I was clearly her daughter. But now I would say that I have rhythm at least. But as far as my mother can she's one of those people who can she do choreography throughout her life. And so she will see someone do a dance routine and boop, 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 she's picked it up. She can see it twice, she'll pick it up. It takes me, I've tried to do ballet older. Oh God, I can never pick it up. It takes, I never get the routine down. So I don't have really good body memory or whatever.
Well, one of the reasons I ask about whether you dance is because writing is so tied to rhythm. Rhythm is really important in writing. Do you feel that at all? Do you have an innate sense of rhythm in your writing, or do you spend any time thinking about that, or maybe making adjustments to the writing based on rhythm? Not to be confused with pacing. I think there's a difference between pacing and rhythm. I mean, a sentence has rhythm, but it takes a larger body of writing to express pacing.
Yeah, I do think a lot about pacing and structure, but I will say, as far as rhythm in terms of on the sentence and paragraph level, yeah, I think wherever I always urge my students to start with poetry and to think in poetry about the way people sound and what are the sounds of where you come from. And I do think it influences you, and what you read influences you in that regard too. And I think that, the vocabulary you use, I often employ different languages just to reflect where people are coming from. And then on top of it, I really do believe in that, this is dry, but varying your sentence length. That really just helps to create, a mood in a scene. So, yeah.
So White Horse was a big score because you've got a major publisher, Flatiron, Macmillan, but you've written other novels. So how many books have you published? How many novels have you published?
2 books of poetry, 1 collection of short stories that ends in a novella, 2 other novels, and I have a kid's book coming out, a picture book.
Now, are you at work on your next one or not?
I am. I've just signed a new contract with Flatiron, and I mainly signed it on spec, but I've written half of it, and I think I just need to get back into it. And I am somebody who because I was in academia for so long, and we could talk more about this. I don't know if this is another question, would be better in another question, but, academia values, they sort of like, the fiction writers align themselves with poets because poetry is something that people know, okay, this has supposedly, intrinsic artistic value. So a lot of what you hear about in academia is structure doesn't matter, plot is for Hollywood, language, character, theme. In fact, even less character and almost more theme. And so I really struggled with story and structure because I valued it. And then in this last novel, I read much more nuts and bolts books on story and structure. And I'm glad I did because in the last novel and the next, I think I've mastered, to go back to pacing, or but moved ahead in leaps and bounds when it comes to like things like pacing, structure, stuff like that. So.
Now you signed a new contract. Is it a 1-book deal, a 2-book, a 3-book?
It was going to be 2, but what happened in August is everything but romance basically plummeted. So they decided on a 1. But I'm very happy with Flatiron. They're fantastic. My editors are fantastic. The PR team, the marketing team, and they're just also, they're great at their jobs, but they're good people to boot. And when you're in small presses, like all you ever hear is like, oh yes, the man, dad, big presses. But I had, early on in my writing career, I had small presses take advantage of me monetarily, and that happens all the time. Whereas, Macmillan, everything is if they say they're going to pay you this, they pay you this, and they pay it when they pay you. So, or they pay you when they say they're going to pay you. So, yeah.
So how did that happen? Everything but romance pancaked.
I don't know. I guess during the pandemic, what happened was a number of things, and other major things culturally that impacted the book world, including Black Lives Matter. And I think Native American fiction finally took off and became much more diverse. You have your crime writers like my partner, David Haskell Wanley-Wyden, or Brandon Hobson and Kelly Jo Ford, 2 Cherokee citizens who are doing realism, right? You just have my friend Rebecca Roanhorse, who's a killer, just, a fantasy writer, dark fantasy, depending on how you look at it, right? And so all of that happened, and that's wonderful. And there are people, like I said, who would like to boil it down to 1 again. But I think that even though I don't believe that's going to happen, no matter how many bad people try to make that happen, I do think that for whatever reason, when people went back to work and all these companies and different institutions decided, no, you have to be back physically, or at least a lot of them did, people's reading lives went down. And that is a tragedy. But for whatever reason, romance did not. And I don't have that answer. I find I could probably theorize, but I think, somebody more directly in the publishing business could tell you better.
What is your theory?
I don't know if I even have one. I don't know. I mean, maybe I just want to be happy after this cultural maelstrom,
right.
And romance is just sort of happy making. Like I don't think that's look, I'm not a romance writer and I have nothing against it. I just want to make sure I don't ever speak for people in a genre that I don't know anything about. Right. Cause I've certainly been a victim of that myself. So what I'll say is that, I have listened to the writers who write Gothic romances, because there's a crossover with like paranormal or horror. And they basically will say that for them, the primary marker and the one that absolutely has to be there is that there has to be a romance and it has to have a happy ending, which I didn't know. I thought, if the plot has a relationship with the core, it's a romance. And I have heard anyway that that's not true. It has to have a happy ending. I don't know if that's true. So maybe you want a happy ending. Yeah,
maybe. Now, it's interesting that you bring up romance and all that, because just yesterday I was reading The Economist, and it said that romance is booming in England, that's a really hot category. They didn't say, I don't believe they said other categories have been depressed, but romance is hot. And I know there's a tremendous number of readers out there for romance. So, well, good for them. My understanding is that you like magical objects and magically imbued things. Do you have a talisman? Do you let's speak to that, whether you have a talisman or what are magical objects to you or magically imbued things, and do you possess any of them?
I think that more than anything, part of why they hold such power for me is because they don't exist in this world. Or if they do, you would have to be like, oh, wow, I'm the person who has unveiled this mystery. And so when I was really starting to be like, I think I want to be a speculative writer, that's really, I think, where I have like the most joy. I was watching Lovecraft Country, I was reading Mexican Gothic, and the thing that I noticed was that when I was most interested, not most, but one of the places where I was like interested in that way was when they had these objects of mystery, and there would be a light shining on something and it would like open a portal and you'd go in the portal and in the portal would be a magical tree. And there's just something about that that is so hilariously compelling to me on every level. The closest I have to it is my family. I do have a bracelet that was passed down in my family for a number of generations, and it's kind of like what it is in the book, but I imbued it with meaning, like symbols that had more meaning for the book, right? Because that's what fiction is you make stuff up, and it's not meant to be. I think you're hearing somebody who's like on the other side of like stuff, right? But it really kind of cracks me up when people, and infuriates me too, when people are like, I've read the book's description and I think you're harmful. I'm like, this is not the purpose of fiction, to be a two-dimensional endorsement, right? So in any case, I did make stuff up in a fictional novel, but the actual bracelet is something it's a copper bracelet, which was kind of popular for a long time. Supposedly it helps arthritis, and it has more Plains Indian stuff on it. And my family, I'm not even sure when it came into my family. That's the part that's very true in the book, is that all I know is it was passed down. And so it has a kind of, I guess at the minimum, it's a little bit of a mysterious time traveler. So I would say that in some ways, yeah, that's my deepest object of mystery that exists in real life.
Let's jump back to the novel you're working on now. Is that also a horror novel, or is it something else? Yeah. How big a departure will it be from White Horse then?
A little bit of one. It's called Room 904. I loved the title Psychomanteum, and my editor was like, maybe for another one. He just thought it was just way too like heavy metal, I guess.
So what's the title again? What?
Room 904. Yeah.
Gotcha.
And basically, it's about someone who it's very different character from Carrie. I think she's a funny native lady because I like that kind of company. But essentially, in her case, she was getting her PhD in psychology, and her sister had been in and out of rehab, and she calls her up and she's like, "You've got to get to the Brown Palace," which is a local luxury hotel here. It has a long history. And she's like, "Look, I'm drunk. I'm graduating. You come here." And then she hangs up on her, and her sister suicides. And this is the first time that she ever has any kind of vision. Like, her mom and her sister are always like, "Oh, I see spirits." And she's like, "You're not seeing anything." And she more identifies with her, seemingly white dad who, is a scientist. But when her sister dies, she comes to her, basically kind of in a dream, but in reality. And then this intense paranormal ability is turned on, and she can't go into academia. She's destroyed over her sister's suicide, and she decides to become a paranormal investigator. And she and her best friend, this guy named Alejandro, they go from hotel to hotel or house to house and sort of help people solve these sort of paranormal crimes or what have you, or validate a paranormal situation. But the Brown Palace calls her and says, "Look, you got to come in and help us with this crime. A person's died. Someone dies every 9 years, 2 women, and you really need to come in." So she comes in. It's her sister that's haunting the Brown Palace instead of who used to be.
Wow.
And she's like, "I'm not going to take this on." But then her mother checks in, and it's her mother who has 2 weeks to live, or 3 weeks to live, unless she takes on the case, if you will.
Wow. Now, have you ever had a paranormal experience of your own?
It's really funny. I have said in every interview, like, no, and my mom has, and my sister has, and my auntie has, and everyone in my family. But I kind of have. I've had basically one, but it's like much more ambiguous. Like I said, I'm Chiricahua, and my family was in Mexico for a while, but then they came back up to Texas. But I have to assume some of my relatives were in New Mexico at some point, maybe in the Santa Fe, Albuquerque area. And why I say this is because I don't have these kinds of experiences ever. I am not that guy. However, there was a visiting writer when I was at the Institute of American Indian Arts. And I'm like, hey, we should go to this cathedral here. It has this thing called the Miracle Staircase. And we go in. I swear I'd been in there before, and I don't remember this feeling. And I'm suddenly really not okay. And I'm like, I don't know, I don't know. And then about 5 minutes later, I'm like, if I don't get out of here, I'm going to lose my mind. I got to get out. I'm so sorry. And my friend, who was from a reserve in Canada, was like, oh, that's so res. And I'm like, yeah, sure, And literally so traumatic, I blanked it out. And so a few years later, I took another native there. I swear to God, I'm sure someone would be like, she made this up. But it is absolutely true. I forgot the experience, went in, had the same experience. This time it was a woman, a writer from here whose mom was from a reservation. She said the same thing. That's so resy. I'm like, I am urban through and through. And I just thought, what am I experiencing in there? And that's the closest that I've ever had to a paranormal experience. My mom has been sort of visited, she would say, by my dad. She said she smelled his hair dye one night a few years after he died. My sister has all kinds of, wild experiences. My auntie does, but that's the closest I've come.
Interesting. So what do you wake up in the morning thinking about? There's a personal question for you. Is there any consistency to what you're thinking about when you wake up in the morning? Probably the biggest stuff on my mind is my writing career and other people's writing careers. I am not. I'll break myself before I'll let this current extreme diversity in Native American letters die. I won't let that happen. So I think about that a lot, and my particular relationship to it. And I think about my niece. I'm always worried about her. I don't have biological children of my own. I have 2 stepkids, and I love them. And then my niece, I think about her a lot. And in some ways, I'm just thinking, like, I had to do this, I should do that, this email, that email, I have to go here, go there. And I traditionally am an insomniac. So if I haven't slept, I'm thinking maybe I can get more sleep. So insomnia, is the insomnia of the kind that you have trouble falling asleep, or do you wake up during the night and have trouble getting to sleep, or is it both?
Sometimes it's both, but I would say yeah. But I do have a lot of I wake up and I have trouble going back to sleep. Trazodone has been helping lately.
That's a pharmaceutical that you take one every night. Is that how it works?
I've started to, because I kind of am like, I don't want to resort to that. I've taken natural supplements. I've taken, what is it called?
Melatonin?
Melatonin, and I take sometimes that with...
maybe kava or
it's melatonin.
valerian?
It's definitely melatonin. I take melatonin with Benadryl, and sometimes that helps. But yeah, I used to have much more intense insomnia than I do now. So, but I still have it.
Okay, interesting. Any side effects from the sleep medication?
No, and I like I said, I actually really, really, really hesitated to take anything pharmaceutical, but actually, I don't do well with a lot of things. Like I'm allergic to anesthesia, and I'm, you know what I mean. Like
so you're cautious about that. Yeah, you react to things in a big way sometimes. So you're cautious generally.
Exactly.
Yeah, sometimes sleep medication, they say you don't really get quality sleep, or there are side effects. My ex-wife used to take Ambien, and oh my God, she'd get up during the night and eat and not even know she got up and ate, and then accuse me of eating the food.
Oh, no. Yes, I've heard that. It's terrible.
You are now a fan of metal bands, is my understanding. You weren't always a metal, a rock metal type person, I don't think. Correct me if I'm wrong, but who are your favorite? Do you have a couple of favorite metal bands?
Yeah, I think what happened was I grew up in a working class town. We're natives. and white folks really loved metal. And I found it like a phrase used today. I found it like, toxic masculinity. Although I always kind of liked David Mustaine. I always liked Dave Mustaine of Megadeth. And I was more of like an indie rock person or hip hop person. But what happened was I came around to understand why people liked heavy metal, and I came to find the bands that really did speak to me. And I came back around to Megadeth, and I realized how much I liked it, and Metallica, which are the big ones. And then there's a local band that has some indigenous members called A Feather and Bone, and that's in the book. And then I think there's one called Corpse that I really like lately. But yeah, look, I'm a 90s kid, and so I love Nirvana and Pearl Jam and Dr. Dre, and I love like indie hip hop too. Like, who was I just? It was I just thinking. There's a British or French hip hop guy, MC Solar. I love him. So I have a really wide sense of what I like. It's just that I've come to understand why heavy metal has the power that it has. So
my understanding is your boyfriend is also a writer. So how is the interplay between his work and your work, between his personality and your personality? Can you talk about the mosaic a little bit?
Yeah, we're both really intense personalities, which is mainly good now that we've kind of figured out a rhythm there. I think that, and he's a crime writer, and I think my work sort of has a crime-ish center often just because I think that helps you to form plot, and I traditionally wasn't amazing at that. And so, but yeah, he and I talk things over. I would say Dave would say, I don't think Erika's influenced me. But yeah, of course, I've been a writer for a long, long time, and he was a political scientist before this. And so, we've had lots of conversations. I've told him what my thoughts are on Native literature, content. He's also Native. He's, in World's Changu. And so he puts his work on the res. I'm very urban. What the biggest influence I think he had on me was that he sort of, as he was coming up as a writer, he was reading these very nuts and bolts books about plot. And I was like, maybe I should read that because I've read all these fancy books and I'm not getting the answers I want. And so he was right. Those were really great books because they kind of taught me like, hey, historically, a lot of people have put the catalyst here at the front. And this is what it is. And so that was helpful, even if I deviate from it. And I think to just our conversations back and forth and how we feel about language, theme, those kinds of things that we help one another. So,
oftentimes writers are introverts. They save their communication for the written page and they don't do a lot of talking. Are you and Dave, I think you said his name is, are you introverts or extroverts?
I would say that if people don't know me very well, they're like, she's an extrovert. She loves being around people. And it's because I am like many introverts. I had to develop a personality to survive. And so part of that personality was like a lot of people I grew up with were very funny. And so luckily I have a sense of humor and I can kind of deflect and at the same time deal with my environment. And in all reality, what I enjoy is I don't really enjoy parties that much. I enjoy one-on-one conversations with my friends that are very intense. Or I enjoy I need a lot of time alone to recharge, even when I'm not writing. And then I do, even though it's work, I do love a reading. I do. My mother is a dancer, and I guess, and her mom was a blues singer. And so there's a public performance quality that I enjoy.
So given that you have some paranormal beliefs and some spiritual beliefs, do you ever feel while you're writing that you're channeling the writing, that the prose is maybe coming from a different place and that you're almost like a receiver or medium?
Yeah, if you'd asked me a few years ago, I would have said I was an atheist. I was pretty... I think I was more like, I'm a pagan technically. So what that means is I care about this life and I care about the people who come after me versus some mythical idea of where I might go. But I think at a certain point I was like, all right, I was really interested in physics, and it sort of made me think a lot about, possibilities. And so that sort of expanded my thinking. I can say that, the traditional idea I don't like, right? The European idea of it's arrogant to create art, so therefore you have to attribute it to God, i.e. the muse. I don't like that. It's just too European for me in terms of like the concept. However, I will say that whatever goes on, if it's the subconscious, if it's the news, whatever it is, I will sometimes it's just work, and that's okay. Great stuff can come out of that. But yeah, there are times in which I feel like I'm in the zone, or it might be like the muse is inspiring me. And I have read back on material of mine where I'm like, I have no memory writing that. No memory whatsoever. And that's a cool feeling, wherever it comes from, whatever your idea around it is.
Have you ever been to a psychic reading? I mean, you personally had a psychic reading?
I've had, I think, one or two. One I remember, so I'm currently, anyway, a professor at Western Illinois University. So it's very, very, very isolated little town in the middle of nowhere. And they want me to be there physically, and I don't. So there is a problem, a big problem. But I think the one I remember going to was there, and because my friend wanted me to go, and I was like, why not? But the problem there was that the woman just kept being like, she wanted it to be all about love, and she kept saying, oh, you fell in love with someone years ago, that's your soulmate, you should be with him. That guy died from, climbing a mountain that he shouldn't climb because, he didn't want to pay the $30 fee to go above the timberline. And it was, of course, very sad, but no, I don't think that's the only person that I could have ever been happy with. And I don't know why she fixated on it. So, but I'm always curious about it. Like people, they'll talk about Ouija boards, and I would absolutely use one. I wouldn't be able to help it. Right. But I just, for some reason, haven't. And then similarly, like I'm always, whenever I'm one of those people that I don't go, but every time I see psychic reading by the side of the road, I'm like, I should do it, but I just don't do it. So.
What do you consider to be the strongest part of your writing game? Is it character development? Is it pacing? Is it dialogue? Is it setting moods? What would you say is your standout strength?
I think because I was so poor at structure, I think I wouldn't say that that's like my big standout and gosh, I'm amazing at it, because it's people like David Mitchell. Those are the folks I think are just masters of structure. They have complex structure, and yet they hit all the notes. And those are the folks that I'm like, wow, yeah, But I think that I can create a page turner because I do care about structure, and I've worked very, very hard on it. And I don't have any illusions about it. I'm not like, oh, the muse will just lead me. I think that's, I don't know. I find it arrogant. But I think that what does matter, I think I have complex characterization. I have learned, these sorts of tricks like, what is a red herring? What is a twist? I think those are things that I think are, joyful and fun to read. And I've learned how to do those. And I like that. I think I'm good at that. I think that what I enjoy the most, I have to admit, is sort of these poetic backstory bits that I wrote in White Horse, which are probably reminiscent of, my more postmodern work or my poetry, where it's very led by the language, and it's very mood driven. And I get to kind of turn around the language and create a mood and create tension around language in a way that I don't think is sustainable over 80,000 words for me. But in a short section is fun. And I think I'm unique there.
What do you struggle with writing?
It was absolute structure. I'm still mad at myself. I just, people will just sit there. They don't have any idea about what any structure should look like in a novel. And they'll say things like, oh, I've heard Save the Cat is so cliche. And I'm like, you got to start somewhere. You have some, like, before you're so convinced of your own genius, maybe sit down and think like, what would be the simplest way that other people have done this? And then what are more complicated ways? And so it was structure. And because I was taught by people who maybe in very sweet and well-intentioned ways just didn't value it. And now I'm bummed out because I think I could have written books that were a little more compelling in that way. So
other than the actual act of writing and the practice of writing, what do you do that improves your writing the most? Other than the writing itself, are there any other activities, anything else you do that actually improves your writing?
Absolutely, reading craft books by people who I respect. I think Ben Percy's Thrill Me, Chuck Wendig's Damn Fine Story. I'm always looking for one that isn't like, here's my, philosophy of the world, but, it's a craft book. No, I want to know on a nuts and bolts level how you did that thing. And Jane Cleland, Mastering Suspense, Structure, and Plot, that was a phenomenal book. It's so interesting. And I just feel like I really do wish more people who identify as literary would say, oh, okay, I want to do a more complex structure. I don't want to do these traditional beats in the exact order that, is played out in Save the Cat. That's fine. But, then read craft books that tell you those alternative structures concretely. And, I just think that, I don't know, I just think that matters so much, and it makes for such a better read.
So did you or do you attend writers' conferences and book expos in search of, you have an agent now, but
yeah.
Did you attend in search of an agent, and as well as just meeting other writers and trying to learn more from the panel discussions and keynotes and all that?
Yeah, I used to attend. I attended AWP pretty much every year for years because I identified, like I said, as a literary writer. That's where all the literary writers go. But it's, and I'm going to go. But it's this year. But it's definitely a different conference than when I first went. When I first went, you would see Macmillan. You would see Del Rey, like you'd see these big presses there, and they're gone. And I'm sure a lot of people are like, "Good, that's the man." But it makes for a different environment. It's very, very academic now. It's very, very language driven, experimental. And I really only have one toe left in that game. I started attending, I went to, I think, WorldCon, which is for fantasy, science fiction, and somewhat horror. That was fun. And I started going to StokerCon, which is specifically for horror. And I probably will continue to go to that no matter what, because it's a smaller group. It's an interesting group. I like those folks. And I was never able, there was an agent, or there is an agent to writer program at AWP. I did it once, and I wasn't wonderfully successful. I found an agent a different way, but I do know that's available.
Talk about how you want your career to develop. You just hit this milestone with Whitehorse and a big publishing house. Ideally, where do you want to see your career go? How will it develop? And don't be shy about what you'd like to see happen. I'm curious if, in an ideal world, how will it all unfold?
I would consistently like to write, a lot of people, when they think of horror, they think of slashers. And my indigenous brother from another mother, Stephen Graham Jones, that's what he does. And he does these sort of postmodern slashers that somehow cross over into the mainstream. And that's awesome. I am far more compelled and frightened and by the paranormal. That is what I love to do. And I still love to employ the tactics I did learn in the literary world that they are so good at, which are, again, depth of theme, complex characterization. And so I want to continue to do that for as long as I can. I like academia. I love teaching. I've done it a long time, though. Ideally, I'd love to go write for a TV show. And that's transition can be hard to make. I talked to someone yesterday, and they were like, well, what you can do is apply to all these programs. And if you get in, you just have to be in LA for 16 weeks. And I'm not opposed to that, but that seems... I feel like, if someone would just sort of like hire me as a consultant, see how it goes. I could get some experience and I can move forward. I think there are writers like Victor LaValle or Tanner Reeve Dew, whom they're just brilliant writers. They're absolutely literary. They're also horror writers and just good people to boot. I kind of admire their trajectories. I will say neither one of them have entirely left academia, though. But Victor has had a lot of stuff recently turned into... like The Ballad of Black Tom, I think, and I can't remember if The Changelings is also going to TV or movie, but I know he's had a couple of projects move forward that way. I adore Grady Hendrix. He's stylish. He's cool. He's a phenomenal writer, super smart. He writes for TV and writes screenplays, and he has a lot potentially in the works. And so I think those are starting to be the writers that I feel like I identify more with, and I wouldn't mind that kind of trajectory.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What do you consider to have been the turning point in your writing life? When did it take a turn that really kind of set you on the path?
There were probably two really important ones, and the first one was I was 20 years old, 21. I was in grad school. And this scholar sat me down because my parents had tried to scare me out of writing, right? They were like, absolutely not. You could write on the side. So I, even majoring in English, was like, what are you doing? And so when I went to go get this master's in English, the pragmatic thing at the time anyway, no longer, was to do it in English literature and become a scholar and get a literature job. And so, and I think I still have that. Like, if you Google me, you'll see BuzzFeed, LitHub, you'll see articles in the Writers Chronicle that I've written to boost other Native writers because I really care about that. And I do want to see that in my future too. I want to always see that in my future. That is something I'm always thinking about. But in any case, the scholar took me to a couple of journals that publish Native American criticism. And I realized that this is just not primarily what I wanted to do. And I started to privately just write poems and short stories. And then when I got to the PhD, I took a ton of creative writing workshops. And so that was the first big turn. And the second big turn really was when I realized I wanted to be a speculative writer and I wanted to study structure. And I just feel like my work just got so much stronger. So after that.
Talk about your writing regimen. When you are in the throes of writing, you're getting pressure from your agent or editor that let's get to it, and you're writing in an aggressive way. What is that writing regimen? When do you write? How long do you write for? Give us some insight.
I don't normally have writer's block. I actually am pretty especially now that I feel like I can create a sort of like a beat sheet and it's going to change a ton over the time that I write. But now that I have that, I really feel like I can get going and I have a lot of ideas moving forward. And I even a novel called Haunt that I want to write after the Room 904. But what I get sometimes is writer's depression because, it used to be when, an agent would reject me or I'd get an agent and they would take me up to the big five and I'd be rejected. I would just get depressed. I was like, what is the point of this? Now writer's depression comes when there's extreme and disgusting cruelty towards people in the writing world and towards me. That's when I get like, oh God, what have I gotten myself into? Just this is a cruel business at times. But I come out of it because there are so many supportive and wonderful people in the writing and in the Native world, so many. And my routine when I'm out of it, when I'm in a good space or when I'm just not busy, touring or whatever, is I generally speaking try to get up, I try to have breakfast, I have coffee, and then I just try to write for as long as I can and or I have time. And that beat sheet really does help me move forward.
You've mentioned speculative writing a couple of times. Give us a definition. What's your definition of speculative writing?
Yeah, it's a really interesting term because it was first used by Robert Heinlein in 1947, but I don't feel like I've seen it much except in the last 5-ish more years. And so it basically is an umbrella term for science fiction, fantasy, and horror, or anything that suspends the normal rules of the universe, right? But a lot of people take it to mean elevated or literary science fiction, fantasy or horror. I don't think it needs to mean that, though. I think I like it as an umbrella term.
Okay, so final question, Erika. Well, actually, I have two questions. One is you use your middle initial, Erika T. Wurth. Why the middle initial? Initially, it was kind of for flair, but actually now it's good because there's a really young white woman, I believe in her mid-20s, who is curly, like she's the physical opposite of me. She has curly blonde hair. She's very pale, blue eyes, and with my exact same spelling. And, I always feel bad when she Googles herself because she must feel like, the hell, like what? And so in some ways it's just to make it more easily Googleable. Part of it is because that was my mother's maiden name, Temple, and that's my middle name. And I just like having a touch of her family in there in that regard. And yeah, it just gives me, it sounds more writerly. So this other woman literally has the same name, Erika with a K and Wurth with a U?
Yeah, and it's very uncommon. The names are very common, right? Incredibly Germanic. That my dad, like I said, was German, amongst other things, and so it's very, very common. But the spelling together is uncommon. And one time, I was coming back from touring, and I was super tired, and I was going through. There are several airports in New York, and I went to the wrong one. I want to say I went to Newark, and I was like, oh my god! And I realized that, and they're redoing the ticket, and they're like, "Do you have a sister?" And I'm like, "A sister?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah." And they're like, and I was like, wait a minute, are you talking about the other Erika Wurth, with my exact same spelling? So my doppelganger was in the airport, and I kept thinking, God, I hope I see her. That'll be so weird.
Okay, here's the final question. For the aspiring writer out there, whether they've been published or just getting going, what would your advice be to them for developing their writing career?
I think that listen to the people around you, of course, but remember their biases. If you're in academia, they will tell you the plot and structure doesn't matter, and that is just silly. That's silly. And find those nuts and bolts books, and then read the fancy books too. If you're a commercial writer and, they're all plot, and it only has to be one way, go find the fancy books. Go to AWP one year and see what that's all about. I think more or less, I do think that all of these things need to be paid attention to. Character, plot structure, language, all of the things. And I think if you're not snotty and you read really widely, like you read the crime writers for structure and you read speculative writers for world building, although apparently Stephen King doesn't like that word. Sorry, Stephen. And you read the realism writers for these things that they are often masters at, dialogue, depth of theme, characterization, things like this. Read widely, and read widely when it comes to the craft books. Read the postmodernist ones, read the ones that are classic, like John Gardner's. And then, read Chuck Wendig,
Erika T. Wurth, literary horror novelist. Her latest book is White Horse. And there's another one coming behind it. Erika, thank you so much for taking the time. I love your energy level. It's fantastic. And I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the program and share so much of yourself with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much for your patience with our schedules.